Welcome today to our DVD, The Battle for Truth. In the last few DVDs that we've made, we've been talking about archaeological evidence that gives credibility to the Bible. A couple of DVDs ago, we talked about how Jesus said that Daniel was a book that we ought to read. We've already have a DVD on Daniel chapter 2, where King Nebuchadnezzar dreamt about this big image that showed the future of the nations of the earth from his time. Today we come to Daniel 7. This is going to be a different kind of a DVD because it talks about the battle that comes with the truth of God. You see, God has given truth, but Satan came in to this earth and has changed or tried to change that truth. Another DVD will talk about how Satan became Satan and how that evil came into this earth. That's a very important subject. But first of all, I want to take you to Turkey, particularly to the land where the Hittites used to live. As I mentioned in another DVD, the Bible mentions the Hittites something like 64 times. And for many years, people were skeptical about these Hittites. Where were they? Was this just an imaginary name that came up in the Bible? Because, while we could know where the Egyptians lived, where the Canaanites lived, where the Israelis lived, the Hittites, we couldn't find them. And people, as I said, just were skeptical about the existence of Hittites. But come to Turkey. 100 years ago, just over in fact, the town of Karkemish was found. This was a Hittite city, and from then on, over the next 100 years, something like 36 towns of the Hittites have been discovered. It's rather interesting that in a tablet that comes from Amarna, poor Anacasimum, the wife of Tutankhamun, who had just died, had 90 days in order to get another husband. Where could she get one? And she decided, I'll write to the king of the Hittites. And this Amarna tablet tells us about this letter that she wrote. And she wrote and said, please let one of your sons come and be my husband. My husband Tutankhamun has died. Well, in those days, we didn't have email, we didn't have faxes, we didn't have telephones, and it took a long time for her couriers to go to Turkey, and then the king's couriers to come back to see if the story was right, because it wasn't too long before that they had been fighting with the Egyptians. As I said, they had 90 days. 90 days isn't very long when you don't have emails and faxes. Unfortunately for Anacasimum, 90 days passed, and she had to marry a big, old, fat priest, Ai. The Hittites were indeed a people, and the more we discover from the archaeologist's spade, we discover places that the Hittites lived in, where they worked, where they worshipped. And this is one of those places in the northern part of Turkey where they had quite a big fortress. We call this place Hattusas. And here was quite a large fortress indeed, and a tunnel that went right through a wall there. It's amazing how they built these places. All of stone, no mortar, and yet they've been there now for thousands of years. The Hittites also had kings, and they had dignity among their royalty. Here was the Lion Gate that went into a part of the Hittite sanctuary, as it were. The King's Gate. There's a plaster cast of the king there. The original now has been taken to the museum in Ankara. They had homes, they had shops where they sold their oil and their wine. They had sanctuaries, and down in the plain there is where they had one of their sanctuaries. I've taken groups there several times, and right in this sanctuary you can see some of the gods that these people worshipped, and this guide is showing us one of the gods. And inside here you can see a number of what I believe are soldiers. Some people say that they are also gods, but here they are with instruments, and it seems as though they're going to war. But just opposite them, on the other wall, is a picture again of one of their gods in a kind of a human framework. This were the Hittites. And here in the museum of the Anatolian race, the Hittite people come to prominence. There's a Hittite lion. And here are some of the places on the Turkish map which show you where they have found or excavated Hittite remains. Another factor that the Hittites did was to build underground, and we'll come there in a moment, but just look at one or two of these objects inside the museum. I was visiting a small museum at Kayseri, not far from Cappadocia, just on the outreaches of the Cappadocia, and they had just found some more Hittite vessels. These were they. And they allowed me to photograph them as long as I didn't publish them before they had. Well, I've never published them, but these were vessels that were found among Hittite ruins. The Hittites worshipped the cows and other beings. Here you can see people bringing produce to the king, some of the priests of the Hittites, and the sun disk and a deer in the middle. The deer was a great object of worship. They also ate the deer, but around it you see this prehistoric sun rays that were often seen in Hittite culture. As I mentioned, they went underground. They did this to keep themselves from enemy people. This is an entrance into the underground tunnels. I wish we could spend much longer there, but we could just show you a little bit because this was a fortress, as it were, for these people. And they'd have these stones that could roll over into the tunnel to stop any armies from other people or enemy or robbers from coming into the tunnel. Or they'd get into a place, they'd roll two of these stones over, and they had the way of keeping them there so that people were now in captivity. There are great meeting rooms, and it's just amazing the depth of these places that the Hittites had built. Another time I'm going to show you how Christians went down even further. The Hittites had 2 stories under the surface of the earth, but Christians went down another 8, and that was an amazing story in itself. This young man was guiding us at one time, and I said to him, I'd like you to take the people to where people were baptized in the water. And he went down the steps and showed us how the water came in here and how the people were baptized by immersion. This was a Christian custom that came right from the time of Christ and is still practiced in so many places today. So the Hittites were real people, just as Daniel was a real person, and just as Nebuchadnezzar was a real king. And so the Bible, as I have said before, when it's dealing with history, while it's not a history book, it is accurate. When it's dealing with science, while it's not a scientific book, it is accurate. And we have to remember that sometimes we don't understand some things, and probably will not, until God takes his people home again. And I want you to be among those people. Well, Daniel in his book deals not only with images, but deals with beasts. And this chapter 7 that we're going to deal with covers that particular important topic. The name Daniel means God is my judge. Very significant name, because the whole of the book of Daniel, the first part, leads right up to Daniel 8, where judgment comes into play. Another time we'll perhaps talk about that. But the name Daniel means God is my judge. I was at Andrews University in the United States doing some study at one time, and I came to the Andrews University Library. And I was quite excited when I went into the Heritage Room and I saw these images that were made well over 100 years ago and made at Hollywood. An evangelist had gone down there to Hollywood and had these beasts made out of paper mache. And he would use these beasts in explaining some of the prophecies of Daniel and of Revelation. There was the lion. There was the bear. There was the leopard with 4 heads. And there was a nondescript beast, often called a dragon, with 10 horns, and a little horn that came out which destroyed 3 other horns. Now, the interesting thing is that a lot of people read these things in the book of Daniel, And they say, nobody can understand that. Let's try and understand it today just from the Bible. Not from what I say, but what the Bible says. And in Daniel 7, verses 2 to 3, Daniel's saying, I saw in my vision. He was having a vision, which is kind of a dream. But visions in the Bible are generally God-given dreams. I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven, north, south, east, and west, were stirring up the great sea, which was the Mediterranean Sea. The great sea was the Mediterranean. And four great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. There's the lion, the bear with 3 ribs in its mouth. There was the leopard with 4 heads. And there was this nondescript beast, or a dragon, with 10 horns. In Daniel 2, we looked at how there was an image that seemed to have 4 main parts: the head of gold, the breast of silver, the belly and thighs of brass or bronze, and the legs of iron. And then right down we have the 10 toes and the feet of part iron and part clay. When you come to Daniel 7, it seems as though Babylon, also represented, as we've shown before, as a lion kingdom, is similar to the golden head. The bear is similar to the chest and the arms of silver. We come down to the leopard, which is similar to the belly and thighs of bronze. The legs of iron represent this nondescript beast, and then the 10 horns, nations which come up later. And the 10 horns represent the feet of iron and clay. That's just a little summary. Daniel said the first beast was like a lion, and it had eagle's wings. I watched till its wings were plucked off. As we said before, this seems to be the same kingdom as the golden head, when Daniel said to Nebuchadnezzar, you are this head of gold. As we've shown you in the Pergamum Museum, the lion is represented on much of the friezes of the Ishtar Gate, for instance. We saw that lion that was taken up out of the swamp over man. Babylon was the king of kingdoms, as it were. The first was the lion. But it came speedily to power, which are represented by those wings, but the wings were plucked off. Babylon was the head of gold. You are this head of gold. The first beast is Babylon. So it's following a similar way to the image that we saw. Here are the lion friezes on the Ishtar Gate. Babylon was that lion kingdom, that kingdom of gold, that kingdom that had a gold pathway going up to the temple of Ishtar from Nebuchadnezzar's palace. The winged lion represents Babylon. I think that's pretty clear. What's the second beast? This second beast with 3 ribs in its mouth. When you see ribs, you know that something has died. There's suddenly another beast, a second, like a bear. It was raised up on one side, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said to it, arise, devour much flesh. After Babylon were the Medes and the Persians. For a little time, the Medes were stronger. So the bear was raised up on one side. But eventually, the Persians took over the Medes, and they together conquered Egypt, Lydia, which is Turkey, and of course, Babylon. 3 ribs in its mouth, representing 3 nations that were destroyed. The bear beast represents Persia. No question about that, I think. In Persia, you have Persepolis, where the kings had one of their summer palaces. I've been there. It's a magnificent place. And Daniel said to Nebuchadnezzar, after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours. Then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all of the earth. In Daniel 7, we read about this leopard beast that came up, which had on its back 4 wings. Again, it comes up speedily. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. Well, let's go back into history just a little. The leopard has wings. Again, like the lion, it came to power very quickly. And if you think about in history, the next power after Persia was Greece. And Alexander the Great was that first king, and he went to war over many nations. He went right down to India. His men down there got somewhat discouraged. They turned back, and eventually he died in Persepolis that we've just shown you on the screen. He came to power quickly. By the age of 32, history says that he cried because there were no more world to conquer. I suppose the only world that he hadn't conquered was the world of his own soul. We'll leave that to God to judge. But when he died, his 4 generals took over. They were represented the 4 heads that came up out of this beast. So the third beast is Greece. On the image, it was the belly and thighs of bronze, representing Greece, the kingdom that used a lot of bronze, the Greek kingdom that broke up into 4 parts, and because of that, eventually gave way to the 4th kingdom. But Alexander the Great was that mighty king who took over so much of the world. A young man took over from his father, Philip of Macedon, and conquered the then known world. Greece is a wonderful place, going through troubles today financially, but they furnished the world with architecture of a kind that the world had never seen before. You go up into the mountains of Greece and you can find temples and so on that are still standing from being built over 2,000 years ago. Then we come to this nondescript beast. Does this represent Rome well? I think it probably does. And it says about this 4th beast, which we believe was pagan Rome, and it says, "Behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth, and was devouring and breaking in pieces and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns." As we said when we dealt with Daniel 2, that eventually the Roman kingdom, round about the 5th century, was crumbling away. It had been ruling longer than Babylon, Persia, Greece, or any other kingdom before it. For about 700 years, it had basically ruled the then known world, right up into Scotland, right down to the Middle East, and all of the Mediterranean. But something began to happen. Rome made some dramatic changes in its religion. It made some dramatic changes, or tried to, in the Word of God. Around about the 5th century, it says, a little horn came up and spoke great words against the Most High God. And it brought up 3 other horns before it. In history, the Vandals, the Heruli, and the Ostrogoths crumbled under the power of the Bishop of Rome. Not only was the bishop a bishop of the church, but he began to be the emperor, as it were, of Europe. And whatever the emperor said, that happened. Whatever the pope said, happened. And so it was a little kingdom. Not a big place like France or like the whole of Italy. It was just a little kingdom, but it had a mouth which spoke great words. I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, and a little one coming up from among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked up out of the roots. And there in this horn were the eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. Pagan Rome was changing into what we call papal Rome. This is a part of the Christian church. The Bishop of Rome was like other bishops. There was a bishop in Alexandria, a bishop in Antioch, a bishop in Jerusalem. But the Bishop of Rome became very strong because it was under the Roman Empire. At the time of the Christ, the Israelis at that time were against the Roman occupation of their land. They wanted to get rid of it, and they saw Christ probably as a Messiah to get rid of the Romans. The Colosseum had been built. Many Christians lost their lives in the Colosseum. Hadrian's Castle, great bridges were built. They were great builders. They turned pagan temples into churches like this one, the Pantheon. Pantheon means a place of many gods. This was pagan Rome. But pagan Rome was about to change. This little horn power began to change things around to some degree. And Daniel says, I watched till thrones were put in place. The Ancient of Days was seated. 1,000 thousands ministered unto him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. Here's a judgment coming in, and Daniel sees a judgment over this little horn power. And for the rest of the book, and the rest of this chapter in the book, he's dealing with this judgment. But he gives us more. And you might be saying, well now, how do you know that these little horns were kingdoms? And how do you know that this little horn was papacy? Let's go into Daniel itself. He says, I wish to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its nails of bronze, which devoured broken pieces and trampled the residue with its feet. And the 10 horns that were in its head, and the other horn which came up, before which 3 fell, namely, that horn which had eyes and a mouth which spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows. See, Daniel is concerned about this little horn. He has given us a history of the nations, just like in Daniel 2, and he's seen them as beasts, but now he comes to the place where he wants to focus on this power which seems to change the whole world scene to a large degree. This little horn that came up, which was more pompous than his fellows. Notice what it says. He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, against God. Imagine that. A power speaking against God. And shall intend, and I want you to notice this, shall intend to change the times and the law. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time and times and a half a time. This is very interesting. A time represents a year. Times represents 2 years, and a half a time represents half a year, which overall gives us a period of about 1,260 days. It's interesting that in Bible prophecy, a day is a year. In 321, Constantine made the first Sunday law. Now, this text said that he shall intend to change times and laws. Constantine was the pagan emperor, but he had a problem. Christianity was growing rapidly throughout his empire, and they respected God's Sabbath. The Sabbath had been kept all through the Old Testament days, but were not kept in Rome. But because Christianity was growing, the Sabbath also was a big contention, because in Rome they kept Sunday. Sunday had come in through Mithraism from Persia and was worshipped in most of the Middle East. The sun god was important. The sun gave light. The sun gave heat. The sun gave growth to their plants. So they worshipped on Sunday, the first day of the week. But God said the Sabbath, the seventh day of the week, is the Sabbath. 200 years later, an emperor by the name of Justinian enforced these Sunday laws. Constantine wrote the Sunday laws, but he exempted some people, like the farmers and others, a few others. But Justinian said everybody has to keep this law, and if you don't, you can be killed, your property can be taken from you, which it was, and people were killed. And in fact, at that time, the catacombs were built. The catacombs are great tunnels under Rome, and some say that there are several hundred miles or kilometers of these tunnels. I've been down under some of them. And you've got to be careful that the lights are on, because if they're off, you can get lost very quickly, as some have, and gone to their death because they've never been found until their bones have been discovered. Justinian made it very difficult for the Christian church, and at 538 began a time of terror by the church against other people, other Christian people in the main, who did not want to keep Sunday. At this time, the Roman Empire collapsed, and 10 nations grew in its place, as we discussed when we talked about this in Daniel 2. There were the Anglo-Saxons, the Franks, the Burgundians, the Alemanni, all of Europe, 10 nations at that time. Sometimes there were less, sometimes more. Now we have more that have developed out of those particular nations. But it's very interesting. Daniel says that this power would last for time, times, and the dividing of time. As I said before, a time was a year, times was 2 years, a half a time is a half a year. A Bible time was 360 days. And if you go from 538, as we have in this diagram, to 1798, you have 1260 days or years, because a year in prophecy is represented by a day. And this time period is mentioned 7 times in the Bible. You've got it there under the picture. In Daniel 7, twice, it talks about a time, times, and half a time. In Revelation, it's mentioned 5 times as 40 and 2 months, or 1260 days, or a time, times, and a half. It's all the same period of time, and it always deals with this time of difficulty for the church, when there was a real battle for the truth of God, when Satan was firing up the church against church, just as you have a civil war right now in Syria, where Syrians are fighting against Syrians. There were Christians, as it were, troubling other Christians and forcing them to keep Sunday as a day of worship, to change what God had given, mind you. It's no wonder that Daniel says that he speaks great pompous words against the Most High God. This little horn, was able to overcome 3 other horns. You'll see the final horn, or final nation to be overcome, was that of the Ostrogoths. Now you say, how do you know that these horns are nations? It tells us right here that these little horns are kingdoms that would arise. First of all, the first of the beasts, the 4 great beasts, the 4 kings that shall arise. But the saints of the Most High shall possess the kingdom. But then he says, I desire to know the truth about the 4th beast, which was different, and of the 10 horns which came up before it. And then he goes on to say how that these 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise. See, there's no guesswork. These horns are kings, they are kingdoms would arise over the earth, and we've shown you how this happened. This little power was going to root up 3 horns, which it did, and history tells us they were the Heruli in Italy, they were the Ostrogoths north of Italy, and they were the Vandals in North Africa. He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. He tried to change the Sabbath, the 10 commandments, which God had given for all people to obey. The 10 commandments are moral commandments. They're significant and important for the human race. You know, some lawyers in America said, the 10 commandments from the Bible, we can do better than that. Every year they were meeting in this law society, and they decided, well, let's have a go. Let's try and change the 10 commandments. When they came back a year later, the president of the law society said, well, what did you do with the 10 commandments? They came back and said, we haven't been able to change them. The 10 commandments are perfect. They're a wonderful moral code for mankind. But this power tried to change the times and the law. They try to change the commandments of God and the times within the law. What time is there in the law? The Sabbath time. They tried to change the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday, from the Sabbath, the 7th day of the week, to the 1st day of the week. The Vatican is a very interesting place to visit. It's a nation within itself. It's right in Italy, but it's a separate kingdom. They have their separate postage stamps. They have their separate police force, which is supplied by the Swiss people. They have the greatest cathedral in the world, and it's a very attractive place. It's a very attractive religion. But this little horn power changed the truth of God for its people. It didn't change altogether, because there are still people around the world keeping the Sabbath. Millions of people today are still keeping that Sabbath. Here are some of the Swiss guards whom I mentioned with the police force for the Vatican. And there are so many churches that the Vatican has today. It became a persecuting power. And in this church, the Church of Ignatius Loyola, we see how the church as a woman was treading down what they called heretics. And if you look very closely in there, you can see the writings of Martin Luther and of some of the great reformers, being trodden down because they were bringing up again the truth of God. He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall intend to change times and law. Then the saints shall be given to his hand for times and a half a time. Do you know that during this 1260-year period, something like 100 million, maybe 150 million people were killed because they wouldn't stand up to this power? Well, you say, how do we know that this power is the traditional church? Let's go through 10 points. First of all, it arose out of the fourth beast. In other words, it came out after Rome. Rome was established, pagan Rome, then it came out of pagan Rome. It was among the 10 horns, came up from among those 10 kingdoms. And it was after the 10 horns had been established. And that's why it was able to defeat the Huruli, the Ostrogoths, and the Vandals. It was different from all the other horns. You see, the other horns were political. But this was not only political, but spiritual. It took on a spiritual realm. Religion began to come into the state. And of course, this was always a dangerous thing. Jesus himself separated the two. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, but to God the things that are God's. He was stronger than the others, more stout than his fellows. He uprooted 3 kingdoms and then claimed to be God on earth. He spoke great words against the Most High God. And we could probably spend a lot of time to show how that he did this. He wore out the saints. He persecuted the saints. We'll talk a bit more about this another time. Not a very wonderful subject, really. But God has given us this subject to help us to identify things in our time and things in history that we can understand that his word is true. As I said before, probably 100 to 150 million people were killed. Their bones have been established in so many places. And he thought to change the times and the laws. Changed the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday. He removed the second commandment. Not only did he touch the Sabbath, but he removed the second commandment, which says you shall not worship any graven images. The only person we should worship is the God of heaven. And then he reigned for a time and times and a half a time, 1260 years, from 538 to 1798. This pretty well establishes who the little horn power is. I've been to Cappadocia in Turkey a number of times. There they have these amazing homes built among the stalagmites, and villages were built here. The Christians came here in the 6th and 7th and particularly the 8th centuries, getting away from the persecution of Rome and later from the persecutions that came from the Islamic faith. It's an interesting place, and I'll bring you back here another time. But this is where the Hittites first built these underground villages and where Christians went down even another 8 stories. But the time would come when the judgment would come against this little horn power. Daniel is very clear about that. Jesus Christ, who rose on the 3rd day, went home to heaven, is on the right hand of the Father, now takes on a judgment phase of his work. The court shall be seated, and they shall take away his dominion and consume and destroy it forever. The time is coming, friends, soon, when, or this will happen, God will take away his dominion. And then what will happen? The kingdom and the dominion, and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole of heaven shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominion shall serve and obey him. I like this text very much because it affects you and me. The greatness of the kingdoms and the whole heaven shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High God. It's very important that we follow Jesus, that we trust in him, that we serve him, and we help to share the good news about him to other people. As that stone came out without hands and smote the image on the feet, which represented the coming of Christ, so this chapter also finishes with the coming of Christ, when he will give his dominion to the people who have followed him, who have trusted him. Isn't that a wonderful thing? His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominion shall serve and obey him. There'll never be another power that will come up and take the place of Rome, Babylon, or Medo-Persia, or in those kingdoms. only the kingdom of Christ. Nobody can take that kingdom away from him. And that is an everlasting kingdom. And people in that kingdom will live forever. Because of sin, because of what came into our earth, and we'll study that another time, we die. We become sick. We become diseased. But this kingdom is an everlasting kingdom where there'll be no death. Friend, I want to be in that kingdom, don't you? Let's plan to be there. Let's study this word even more and understand the great truths that God has given to us that are found in this book. Let's thank him for what we have seen and heard today. Our Heavenly Father, what an amazing prophecy. That 500 years before Christ, Daniel was able to see what was going to happen after Babylon, that there'd be Medo-Persia, there'd be Greece, there'd be Rome, there'd be the 10 kingdoms, a little horn power would come up. This would be a religious power which would change the face of your word, or try to. But we thank you that today we can understand these things and we can follow the original truth that you have given to us. I pray that you'll bless everybody who's been looking at this DVD. Bless them in their home, in their work, in their university, whatever they're doing, and help them to know the love of God and the wonderful love of Jesus Christ, his Son. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to you in our next DVD. God bless you.